discouraged and think it's never going to work out.
Knowing that there is no room for God beyond
Good evening, and thank you for watching. Tonight, we're going to depart from the course we have been taking, which has been talking about dispensationalism. And we're going to talk about something actually that generates some of the most views I get for the videos that I've put out in the year that I've been doing this program, and getting the most comments, and that's the topic of Calvinism. Understandably so, of course, because Calvinism is something a little bit of everywhere. And there's a lot of Calvinists out there. A lot of Calvinists are scholars. Calvinists are very smart, intelligent people. A lot of the people that watch this program are Calvinists. A lot of Calvinist friends out there. So that's going to be the focus of tonight's program, which we've talked a lot about in the past. And I'm going to tell you about the debates I've been kind of hyping. One of which, actually, I guess a couple of are related to Calvinism. So we'll talk about that here in just a minute. So, tonight, we will talk about and I'll give you my comments on the debate. Really, it was a discussion, if anything, that took place, I forget, it was earlier this week, I forget what, I guess it was Friday, last Friday? I can't remember now, but I think it was Friday. But, so that's what we're going to do. Who are these guys? Why are we talking about them? Well, I'll tell you about all that here in just a second. But it was a discussion about James White and William Lane Craig, well-known people in theological and scholarly circles anyway. And it was on the problem of evil. Also, it was really a Calvinist versus Molinist discussion. You may not have heard of the term Molinist. Well, we'll talk about that somewhat here, but that's not going to be the focus. But that's what the discussion was about. But I'll get to that more here in just a second, okay? Now, I've been telling you about some debates coming up. I can tell you some more information here about one of them. Of course, I have given you some dates. But this little thumbnail here is from Standing for Truth YouTube channel. This is what he has. So it will be, as you can see, January 28th. This is a discussion on Calvinism. And we've had this, or I've had this debate on Romans 9 before. There's a lot of Romans 9 debate out there because it's a big text for the Calvinist theology, which I disagree with completely. But, so the gentleman here, who I don't really know, is Tyler Vila, other than I know he's a Calvinist. And he does a lot of material against atheism, evidently. So seems to be a pretty nice guy. And so this is on the Standing for Truth YouTube channel, January 28, 10 p.m. And that's late. I think that's too late for a debate. But, that's what they wanted. And so, got to do what we got to do, I guess. But, so that'll be coming up. And I'll tell you about the other two, one of which is in February, when I get more information. Okay, so, all right, here we go. Now, I'm just going to tell you ahead of time, I got somewhat of a cold going on here or something. So I'm going to be blowing my nose probably pretty regularly. I hope that doesn't bother you, but it's a necessary evil tonight. So it's just the way it is. You know how that goes. Now, I got to say, I talked earlier about Calvinism generating the most attention on my YouTube channel when I talk about Calvinism. And that's just the nature of what it is. Calvinism, Reformed theology, as it is also called, is out there a little bit of everywhere. And that's whether for good or for bad. It's a good thing if you're a Calvinist or a Reformed theologian. If you're not, I guess it's a bad thing. But it's a theology that I do not agree with, as most of you know. So this discussion happened with James White and William Lane Craig. Now, so the topic is larger than just these individuals. A lot of you may not know who they are, and that's okay, because ultimately the material we're going to talk about is going to be what is going to benefit you, even if you don't even remember who these people are when we walk away from here, but that's okay. But nevertheless, a lot of people know who these are, and it will not do us any good if we don't have some information. Well, William Lane Craig, also known as Bill, is probably the most famous Christian defender in the world. I mean, there's a lot of them. The kind of old time is C.S. Lewis. Then you have, in modern time, you have Frank Turek, and he's okay. John Lennox. These are all very smart people. William Lane Craig is a brilliant thinker. Now, he's very philosophical, but he knows a lot about the Bible, and I agree with several of his positions in the Bible. Not everything, but a lot of it. He's very much not a Calvinist, so that's why this discussion happened. James White, the other individual whom we've talked about on this program a lot, he is a well-known Calvinist. And I think one of the more ready defenders and apt defenders of Reformed theology that's out there. Now, most of you know what Calvinism is, right? So I'll say a few things about that here in just a bit. But what is Molinism? Now, everybody's heard of Calvinism to some extent. Probably not too many people have heard of Molinism. And as I said, you don't need to know what Molinism is to be a Christian. You can live your whole life without being a Molinist or knowing what a Molinist is. And even Mr. Craig here would say the same thing, I believe. And again, that's not my focus. I'm not a Molinist, but I agree with several of the aspects of what is called Molinism. And so, it's a philosophical / theological position that tries to interpret certain information about man's evil and God's sovereignty, which I don't think is too difficult, actually, to be honest with you. And without ever having heard of Molinism, I really have no problem reconciling those two things biblically. Calvinism tries to. Now, Calvinism's another philosophical, theological construct that tries to make sense of these two things together. Human evil and responsibility and free will and God's sovereignty. And I think it does a horrible job. Good evening, Walter. Now, Walter here, we've had these discussions as well on Calvinism. He's a Calvinist. But nevertheless, and so what I'm trying to say is, you guys out there, you know these discussions. Now, I know Walter knows about these things. I'm just trying to inform everybody who may not know what Molinism is. Interestingly, Walter here, a regular of the program here, he said that he's got some Molinism. So, it gets interesting out there. There's all kinds of different ideas out there. Nevertheless, I haven't explained Molinism yet, but my point is, let me just get to that. Okay, Molinism is this theory that God calculated, this is the terminology I hear William Lane Craig use quite often, calculated which world he wants. Let's make it more simple than that. The main idea of Molinism is that God knows what any person would do in any given situation that they are in. And He created the world in such a way as having all the situations that He wanted, so that any situation turns out with those people that are in it doing what He knew they would do to bring about His end. Does that confuse you? Let me make it more simple. God knows what anybody would do in any situation. And so He's just simply created the world with all the situations He wants, knowing and arranging where all the people in it are going to choose in such a way, freely, as to get exactly the things that He wants, so that they're still freely choosing. Now, Calvinism, God determines even our will and our choices. Now, I'm not a Molinist. Okay, I don't read the Bible thinking about God calculating worlds and actualizing worlds and all this philosophical stuff. Ain't got a problem with philosophy and all that stuff as long as you start with the Bible. Now, he says that he does, and that's fine. I agree with him. I'm just not a Molinist. I've never had the need to be a Molinist. Nevertheless, I do agree what is called middle knowledge. Again, we're creating these terms just to get a handle on concepts. The most important thing is whether the Bible teaches it or not. Middle knowledge is what I talked about. God knows what anybody would do if he put them in any situation. And so I got someone calling here. I don't think they know I'm live. But if you are watching, you know who you are calling, who doesn't normally watch as far as I know. Call again right after and I'll know you know we're live and you want to call in, okay? But I don't think that the person calling does. As a matter of fact, I'll just hang up. Nevertheless, okay. Complicated, right? The main thing that I agree with in this Molinism idea is God does know what anybody would do in any situation. That's pretty clear. One of the scriptures mentioned is in 1 Corinthians 2, where Paul says, if the rulers of this world had known the mystery that he talks about, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. And that's not because they would have cared, it's just because they knew that it wasn't accomplishing their purposes. You see, God knows what they would have done in that situation had they had the knowledge that they in fact did not have. And we might run some other scriptures. Okay, and he's going to explain his Molinism idea, but it's the Calvinist ideas that I really want to talk about because that's what most people are going to deal with, talking to religious people. And a lot of you out there, of course, are Calvinist, as is already said. So, this is our chance to discuss. Now, I just want to say the reason I chose to do this is because it was pretty popular. A lot of people have been anticipating this. A lot of people do know who these theologians and these individuals are, okay? So, if you don't know who they are, just know we're going to benefit from the content here, okay? Well, I guess let's just start where we are right here. I got several clips, and some of them are just a couple minutes. Some of them are like 5 or 6 minutes. We comment as we go along, okay? The first clip here is Dr. Craig explaining and kind of summarizing the Molinist ideas. It's good for you to hear this, even though it's not the focus.
And the Molinist view is that God has this sort of knowledge logically prior to his divine creative decree.
All right, let me explain what he means. Talking about the knowledge of what everybody would do, that's kind of been talked about. God has it logically prior. What does that mean? Logically prior means, let me just say it in a way that's going to be simple. He had the knowledge before he created. That's really all that it means. And he doesn't mean chronologically before he created. Just he knew before he created. And if you don't understand it at that point, it really doesn't matter at this point. The simple things are going to come up. Just bear with it.
Of a world. And so while everything that happens is governed by God's decree takes into account how people would freely choose under various circumstances in which they might be placed.
Okay, now, let me make sure we're all clear. The discussion concerns the problem of evil. Now, so the way this becomes a Calvinist discussion is because there's this big debate that the problem of evil is, what is God's relationship to man's evil? Calvinism, I think, is problematic because God in Calvinism determines all of man's choices, determines all of man's will, determines his desires, so that all evil is necessary. Man can choose nothing other than what God has determined for him to choose. And thus, I don't think Calvinism answers the problem of evil. I think it causes problems for it. Now, his view, which without me being a Molinist, I pretty much agree with, is that God creates free agents. He creates creatures with free will. And for you compatibilists out there, when I say free will, I mean libertarian free will, of course. For the rest of you who don't know what all that means, it doesn't affect anything for you at this point, okay? Now, so I agree with Mr. Craig, of course. God created man free. We have free will. We make the choices, and He does not determine what we choose. I believe that is very clearly biblical. And, oh, by the way, I must say, Drew here, our friend of the program, he's not a Calvinist, but he, I think, agrees in a lot of ways with the Calvinists in this respect. He's there. I haven't read his comments, but he speaks for himself on that. But so I just think the Calvinists, and I think the deterministic viewpoint at this point of Calvinism, Reformed theology, is just flawed. I don't think it can be held up biblically, and I think it's logically incoherent. If God is decreeing everything man chooses to do, then it's God's choices. Evil belongs to God. So I think this is the problem of evil in Calvinism. So let me back it up a bit.
Governed by God's decree takes into account how people would freely choose under various circumstances in which they might be placed. Now, how does that impact the problem of evil? Well, it seems to me that with respect to the problem of natural evil, that is to say non-moral evil, the difference between the Calvinist and the Molinist is not great. We would both say that these afflictions are within the prerogative of God to impose upon us and fall within His sovereignty and are given for a greater good that God hopes to achieve.
By natural evil, of course, he means storms, sicknesses, diseases, in contrast with what he's going to talk about, which is moral evil.
But it seems to me that the real difference emerges with respect to moral evil. That is to say, the sinful acts of human beings. What Molinism holds is that since human beings have genuine moral freedom to make choices, God, knowing how they would choose in various circumstances, allows them to make sinful decisions that He does not directly will.
Yeah, now, so Drew says here, correct, in regard to what I had said about him, he says God is ultimately responsible for evil. But He does it to bring about more good in the long run than there would have been had He not. So I obviously would disagree with that, but I'm going to reserve some comments there for our material here.
So by God's absolute will, He wills everything good. In every moral situation, God wills that a person do the right thing. But He knows that in many cases people would not do the right thing. They would choose to do evil. And so He permits them to do that evil with a view toward achieving His ultimate purposes, so that God's ultimate plan and providential purpose is achieved not by overriding human free will, but precisely through the free and sometimes sinful actions of human beings. And so I see this as being a vastly more plausible view of moral evil than the Calvinist view, which says that God moves the will of creatures to do evil, and is therefore the cause of their evil acts.
That's very helpful, Bill, and a very succinct explanation. And it involves this concept which you've alluded to, middle knowledge, this idea that God can see all of the possible worlds that could exist, and what people would do under different circumstances, and then presumably instantiates that world in which His ultimate purposes are fulfilled, while not, as you say, overriding the free will, because people are still freely choosing to do what they will do, but God has, as it were, set up the conditions, knowing what they will ultimately freely choose to do. Is that? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, that was very close, Justin. I would just be careful to use the subjunctive mood that he knows what they would do, not what they will do, because he may, seeing what they would do, decide, oh, wait a minute, I don't want to create that world. I'm going to make another one instead. And so what they will do can be quite different than what they would do under certain circumstances.
Oh, I agree with most of the sentiment of that, even though I'm not a Molinist. Okay, now we're going to be getting to the biblical material. That's what matters most, is the biblical aspect of this discussion. That is the heart of this whole thing. But we're just getting a background here of what all this is about. So this is the debate. Calvinism, which answers the problem of evil by saying God determined everything, including evil, but somehow, now, see, here's the interesting thing is, now our friend Drew here goes ahead and concedes, yep, he's responsible for it. Yep, evil is his doing, which I think he's consistent. I think he's wrong, but I think he's consistent. But Calvinists generally just say, God, yes, determines every evil thing. He determines all of man's evil choices, but he's not the author of it. Well, I just think that doesn't work. It just, you can't hold that position. Now, but Drew here is someone who would say, no, yeah, he is. Now, I'm curious, Drew, would you go ahead and say, just in another way, what you have said, I believe, but what the Calvinists generally will never admit, which is that God, in this view, is the author of sin. Would you call God that in your view? Is God the author of sin in this deterministic theology? Now, Calvinists, of course, say, no, he's not. Would you say, yeah, he's the author of sin? But, hey, Dakota, how you doing? Thanks for joining the program. So that's how Calvinism answers it. And I think most of the time just by saying, you got many Calvinists that say, well, it's just a mystery. I don't know how God determines all evil, but is not responsible for it. And then you got compatibilists. If you don't know what a compatibilist is, that's okay for now. You don't need to know. But you got other Calvinists who say, well, he determines it unchangeably, yes, but, and then they say, well, man has a desire and is freely choosing what he desires, but I don't think that works, of course, because it's God that determines his desires in Calvinism. So Drew here says yes. Now, are you responding to what I said? Would you affirm that God is the author of sin in a deterministic theology? He says, if anyone wants to read the great book called Necessity of Sin, let me know. The Necessity of Sin. So if I'm understanding him, he's saying, yes, God's the author of sin. Now, see, I think that's consistent. Wrong but consistent. Calvinists, I think, are inconsistent, but say, you know, he's not the author of sin. Well, I think I have to agree with Drew. If God determines everything, makes God the author of sin. But we're going to get into all that, okay? We're picking out this debate. Okay, so Drew says, I understand him correctly. Okay. Well, I always appreciate consistency. And at the same time, I got to say, I know Calvinists never do say God is the author of sin, and I appreciate them not wanting to say that about God's character. I believe the Bible very clearly teaches God is not the author of sin. And so I appreciate that, but I think they're inconsistent. I think their theology makes it. But that's what the discussion is about. So I am more on the side of Craig, without being a quote-unquote Molinist. I believe God is sovereign enough to create free, moral creatures. They choose it, and He can work all things according to His purpose through their choices. We'll get into all that, okay? But that's why this is over the problem of evil. And so, let me think. Well, no, let's just go ahead. We just ended that. All right, now James White is going to talk about a bit. So, here is our Calvinist friend here, Dr. White.
Faith, I pointed out, God hath decreed in himself from all eternity by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably, all things whatsoever comes to pass.
Now, Dr. White is reading from the famous Confession of Faith. It's not the Westminster Rite. I think it's the London Baptist. Both say similarly the same thing. But so he's reading from a very well-known Calvinist creed, and it's just basically going to say that God determines everything, and then it's going to say, but He's not the author of sin. Well, I got to stand with my friend Drew here. No, you can't have both. You either got one or you got the other. Even God either determined everything and is the author of sin, or a man determines things. By the way, we got lots of videos on this channel talking about free will. We got like a series on free will. To get into this more, I recommend you go back and watch those discussions. But we're going to move along. So he starts out here reading the London Baptist Confession of Faith.
I pointed out, God hath decreed in Himself from all eternity by the most wise and holy counsel of His own will, freely and unchangeably, all things whatsoever comes to pass. Yet, so as thereby is God neither the author of sin, nor hath fellowship with any therein, nor is violence offered to the will of the creature, nor yet is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established, in which appears His wisdom in disposing all things, and power and faithfulness in accomplishing His decree. So obviously, Reformed theologians have strongly emphasized all the issues in regards to secondary causation and how God works in time. And of course,
let me simplify all that. If you came in late, I'm just telling you, I got a cold and I got to be blowing my nose the whole time here. So, what he's saying is, yes, we Calvinists believe that God determines everything and that He's not the author of sin, and that He determines things through means. He doesn't just move things around with His hands, so to speak. He causes chains of events. You know, He doesn't just push over a domino on the end. He puts dominoes or other causes in between and causes those to push over that domino at the end, that kind of thing.
I have argued for quite some time that the incarnation of Christ demonstrates that we're not talking about puppets on strings. We're talking about the reality of God expressing His pleasure in His creation, and in such a way creating mankind so that what happens in the drama of redemption reveals all of God's attributes.
Now, he mentioned something about puppets on a string, because Calvinists get this objection a lot about, well, Calvinism makes everybody puppets. We're just doing what we're determined to do, every choice, every thought. He'll say that again here in a little bit, and we'll talk about it more at that point. But this other idea that he just talked about, that in Calvinism, God is bringing about and creates the world in such a way as to bring out aspects of His character, brings about His will. Yeah, I agree with that. You don't have to be a Calvinist to say that. You don't have to be a Calvinist to believe that. That's not uniquely Calvinist. We all believe God created the world, is working out everything in His will. But since the Bible shows and speaks very clearly that evil is not His will, and that He's not willing for men to repent, then it's a very simple matter of understanding that men making free choices is a part of His will. He doesn't like the choices that they make when it regards evil, but it is His will for them to make them. And so that's not a difficult matter. Man's freedom to even do what is wrong, for man to be free and not caused in his choices, is God's will. Not complicated to me. I've just never found that complicated.
So the real issue is when God decrees, is what flows from His decree freely coming from His will, or is it delimited by something we don't know where it comes from? It doesn't come from God. It doesn't come from His creation. And that is this counterfactual knowledge that we are being told, well, that's just a truth maker theory of knowledge. I would say, from a biblical perspective, if we're going to say that the great Yahweh is limited in what He can do, what is feasible for Him to do, then we need to know from whence comes this strange delimiting authority.
Now let me simplify all of that, okay? What he's criticizing about Craig's view, which is similar to mine, which is that God creates free agents and that God still works His way. Dr. White is basically saying, well, since we Calvinists, we believe that God creates everything in such a way as to express His will, His character, and His purposes, how do you get these delimiting, these truths that limit what God can do? Now, what he's talking about is, well, if God doesn't choose man's choices, then those limit what God can do. And to bring this down to earth, it's kind of like saying, well, how can that be? How can what God can do and what He wants to create be limited? And if He hasn't created man yet, how does the choices of men limit how He creates? I'm trying to simplify this, and it's difficult because I don't want it to be just a Molinist versus Calvinist discussion, because most people don't even know what Molinism is. I'm just trying to keep it down to earth. So the objection can just simply be this. How is it that God's will and what God wants and what He wants with His creation be limited some way? That's a slight modification of what he's arguing to make it fit a more simply Calvinist, non-Calvinist discussion, okay? The idea is pretty simple. And if you go back and watch the free will series that we talked about, or that we did, I think you can learn a lot from that. But it's very simple that God created a creature that can freely choose. It's called the power of self-determination. And God is not being limited, He's limiting Himself. You see, the reason man can be free is because God is choosing not to determine His will. It's God limiting Himself. And if He's really sovereign, as our Calvinist friends say, you have to admit that He's sovereign enough, He has enough authority to create man any way He wants. And if He wants to create man and desires for His creature to make choices not determined by He Himself, God can do that. Now, if you're getting lost in all this, well, these are the discussions people are going to have out there. But we are going to get into the Bible. I got Bible stuff prepared, but we're just getting started here in this discussion.
I don't think that has anything to do with philosophy. It has to do with a claim is being made, so we need to know where that's coming from.
Before Bill comes back on that again, I do just want to pick up, though, just for my sake as much as anything, the fact that you say you don't, Reformed theology has always had in its confessions this view that God is not responsible for moral evil.
Once again, Reformed theology is Calvinism.
Now, you talk about secondary causes and so on, just for those who aren't familiar, because on the face of it, what Bill has said is, in his view, Calvinism does make God effectively responsible. Right. Why isn't God responsible? Why isn't God, as it were, culpable, and humans are, even when God has ultimately set everything in such a way that it was always going to be this way? This was preordained.
There's two things to recognize. We have God's eternal decree, which is not accessible to us. We are time-bound creatures. Then we have His prescriptive decree, which is what He's revealed to us as to what we are to do, what our duties are before Him, etc., etc. We only have access to that. And that is revealed to us in His Word, in Scripture, and in the nature of the world around us. And so in Scripture, we are given numerous examples where God explicitly says, Genesis 50:20, it's been discussed.
All right, here comes some good Bible here. And this is a discussion that we've talked about, but it's a good one. Excuse me. Agnostic theist says James White looked better in the Greg Stafford debate. Yeah, I agree. Now, if you mean by looked better, you mean his material and how he presented it. I agree with him in the Greg Stafford debate. We're going to get into some material here, so let me back it up a bit again, because the question that was asked White, a Calvinist, is, what about this? In my own words here, what about this problem of Calvinists say that God determines everything, but he's not the author of sin. Calvinists say he's not the author of sin, but how is that the case? White doesn't explain it. You notice what White does is just simply say, well, God has his way. He has, quote unquote, secondary causes. Well, okay, but he caused those just as much as he caused anything else. Also, he says we have examples in Scripture, and now he's going to go to Genesis chapter 50, which we're about to go to ourselves. So pull out your Bibles, because that's where we're about to go. Here's the question. Pulling up an example of God determining evil, as Dr. White thinks it is an example of that in Genesis 50. And then saying, but God gives and puts the responsibility on man. Okay, well, if that's understood in Calvinistic thought, then that doesn't explain how God is not really the author of sin. In other words, the question to White is, well, what about the fact that Calvinists say he's not the author of sin? How does that work in your theology? And White's saying, well, it's just, we got examples where that's the case. Well, okay, but examples do not explain how you could rationalize that. And since it's not really rational to hold someone responsible for what they do not have control over, then shouldn't you step back and say, am I understanding this Bible text correctly? Shouldn't that be what you do? It absolutely should, but we're going to go to Genesis 50 here in a bit. And see what he wants. Now, Angie says, God reveals what he wants us to do, prescriptive, but we're incapable of doing it. Yes, that is Calvinism. Prescriptive will, if you don't know what that means, is what God says he wants us to do or not to do. Commands. Don't commit adultery. Do not commit idolatry. Do good. Prescribing what behavior and ethics you are supposed to conduct yourselves in is called prescriptive. So Calvinists say, yeah, God reveals his prescriptive will. Do not commit adultery. But then Calvinists say, but he's got this secret will, which is actually what determines and has everything actually doing, which may be that you do commit adultery. Because for Calvinists, anybody that commits adultery or murder or idolatry is determined to do so. And so you have this contradictory things. God's prescriptive will, telling you what to do, what not to do. But then his will, his secret decretal will, that actually has you doing things that you actually have no choice over. You got no choice on whether you can follow God's prescriptive will or not. Only God does. Now, agnostic theist, I can just tell you, I do not agree with Jehovah's Witness. I've talked about them in articles and whatnot. One of these days, this was just asked last week actually, are we ever going to talk about Jehovah's Witness? Well, I plan on it one day, Lord willing. It's something I've looked into quite a bit. And yes, I absolutely agree. Do not agree with them. But, okay, so, yeah, I'm with you, Angie, if I'm understanding your question right. You're saying how he doesn't give us the ability to actually follow the prescriptive will, to actually follow his commands. That's Calvinism. And it's a contradiction. Now, we're going to listen to what he says. I put it back. Now I want you to listen. Now Drew says, honestly, I don't think most Calvinists would claim to believe that, AK. That's something we concordant believers would say. Don't believe what? Now, you have to clarify what you're referring to, because Calvinists absolutely believe that God has a prescriptive will, and he has a decretal will, a secret will. As a matter of fact, that's what he just mentioned. Angie says that's one of the reasons I left Calvinism. Yeah, so Drew, you just have to clarify what you mean that Calvinists would not believe that. Excuse me. Biting a cold. I got to repeat that because people come in late and whatnot. Yeah, that God is responsible for all sin like we believe. Okay, well, no, you're absolutely correct. That's what I was talking about earlier, Drew. Calvinists, in fact, do not say God is the author of sin. They absolutely reject the idea that God is responsible for sin. Yeah, that's what I was saying. That's why I said you, even though I think you're wrong, are consistent. That's what I was saying earlier. Calvinists, I say it like this. You're consistent in saying if God determines everything, because you agree with Calvinists on that, even though you're not one, if He determines everything, He's responsible for everything, including evil. Okay, you're consistent. But Calvinists, very notably, never say God is responsible for evil or that He's the author of evil, but they do say He determined everything. Inconsistent. Although I do think it's good that God, in their view, is not an author of sin. I mean, that's good that they would deny that, but they just can't do it consistently. Vapor rub, I need something because I got some kind of malfunction of the nasal cavity going on here. No doubt about it. All right, so where were we? Now, I pulled this back because I want you to hear the question. He's basically asking him to deal with this issue of how do Calvinists deny that God is the author of sin if He determines even sin and all evil? He's not going to answer that and just say, well, God has secondary causes. It's like the in-between dominoes. He doesn't just push over the last one. He's got dominoes in between. But He decreed everything that's a secondary cause just as much. So that doesn't answer the problem. He's still determining everything. And then he says, well, we got examples in Scriptures, which we're about to go to. But giving an example doesn't rationalize your understanding. You understand what I'm saying? So he's not actually addressing the issue. He's not dealing with the problem of evil in Calvinism.
In such a way that it was always going to be this way, that this was preordained.
There's two things to recognize. We have God's eternal decree, which is not accessible to us. We are time-bound creatures. Then we have His prescriptive decree, which is what He's revealed to us as to what we are to do, what our duties are before Him, etc., etc. We only have access to that. And that is revealed to us in His Word, in Scripture, and in the nature of the world around us. And so in Scripture, we are given numerous...
So basically, he just said, God doesn't just directly cause evil. He has chains of events. But what Drew just said in the comments is exactly what I'm saying. Drew says, yeah, any causes God puts in place would still be something He's ultimately responsible for. I appreciate you hoping my code gets better. Yeah, it's not good when you're doing a live broadcast to have a cold and be blowing your nose. But we're making it work. So now the second part of his answer is, well, we have examples in Scriptures. Okay, but not answering how that works. Okay, pull out your Bibles, and I'm going to pull it out here on the screen here in just a bit. Genesis chapter 50. Okay, the story of Joseph and his brothers. Now, they're not going to give you a whole lot of context, so I'll just do it ahead of time. We all know the story, I think, where Joseph's brothers sold him into bondage, into slavery, because they were jealous of him. Long story short, he eventually makes his way to the second in command next to Pharaoh. There's a great famine throughout the land, and because of him being in Egypt and having dreams from God, he's able to store up in years ahead of time grain. And so all the people from around Egypt, and even over there where Joseph's brothers are and Jacob, they got to go to Egypt to get some of this grain. And in the end, Joseph makes a statement in Genesis 50. Well, what you intended for evil, God actually intended for good. So in other words, you selling me into slavery was just evil on your part. That's what you intended. You intended something that was evil, but God intended this for good. And he's about to say this is an example of Calvinism, that God determines something like this evil thing like right here with the brothers, but determines it for good. And so that they're doing God's will, which is actually good for God, evil to them. And we'll talk about it. Drew says he can't explain how it works because there's no logical way for his view to work. I agree 100%. That's the inconsistency of Calvinism.
numerous examples where God explicitly says, Genesis 50:20, it's been discussed on your program many, many times by all sorts of different people, but the text says what the text says. Joseph, knowing that his brothers have committed evil against him, knowing that what they did was wrong, knowing even that God had actually restrained their evil. I don't know why God didn't just put them in a situation where they would do freely, but God actually restrains men's evil.
Now, I always have a problem with that. God restrains evil? Calvinists believe, Dr. White believes, God determines everything. Unchangeably so. So what does it mean when he says that God restrains something? So he restrains their evil. In other words, they would have done more evil. Now that's true in the Bible. They were originally going to kill him. They ended up just throwing him into a pit and then selling him to slavery. So God restrains the evil that they intend to do. Now that makes sense from my perspective because they're the one choosing to do evil and he's restraining what they would do. But remember, in Calvinism, the evil that God is restraining is what he ultimately determined. So God's restraining the very things that he himself determined. You see, the brothers are going to be only as evil as what God determined for them to be in the first place. And they're going to be, they're not going to be more evil than what God determined for them to be because he's determining everything. They're going to be exactly what he determined for them to be. So how can he restrain them if their intentions are what he determined in the first place? See, Calvinism doesn't work. Doesn't work. I appreciate that, Angie. I appreciate that. So agnostic theist says he's been called a Calvinist. He don't know what it is. Calvinism, well, I got some quotes that I'm going to be running here in just a second. Let's see. When this clip is over, I got more clips, but when this clip is over, I got some basically definitions, if you will, of Calvinism here in just a second. So stay tuned. I'm not sure why they call you that. I don't know. But what it is, what a Calvinist is, I'll explain more here in a bit. Okay, so back to Genesis 50. Now Walter says there's active determinism and passive determinism. In Calvinism, whether you're a compatibilist, now you say you're a Molinist type of Calvinist. I'm not. You explained some of it in some in a group chat there, but I'm sure I don't got all the ins and outs of how you explain it. Okay, so understanding that I don't know exactly what you mean. I'm not sure how you could be, but to me, the two are incompatible with each other. But you could explain that more one day to me. But in Calvinism, whether, when you say passive, the reality is God determines everything. Your choices. He chooses first what you choose. You can explain that as a way of saying it's passive, but it just doesn't work. But I'm going to go on with the material.
God actually hardens men's hearts in other situations. Why would he need to do any of this if he has just put them in situations where they act freely? But in the situation of what the brothers did to Joseph, God specifically says through Scripture, you meant this for evil. He does not excuse their sin. He does not say, oh, you're just puppets on a string, so it doesn't really matter. He knew what filled their hearts. He
doesn't excuse their sin. Yeah, see, that's why Calvinist doesn't work. Because in Calvinism, you should excuse their sin because God is the one choosing for them to sin. You see, it's just irrational. He's saying, well, but you have an example of my Calvinism in the Scriptures. Joseph's brothers meant their deeds for evil. God meant it for good. But yet God doesn't excuse their sin. Yeah, but he should. If Calvinism is true, why doesn't he? Because he's the one that determined for them to be sinners in the first place. He's the one that determined for them to be evil. So this is not an explanation, just like Drew said earlier. He's not explaining the rationality behind what he's talking about. He's just saying, well, but It's just there. So how does Calvinism answer? If God determines evil acts, how does he then not the author of sin? And his answer is, well, here's an example where he doesn't. He doesn't excuse their sin. Okay, well, that makes sense in my view. See, I can understand why he would not excuse their sin, because they're the one that determine their evil intentions. But it doesn't make sense in Calvinism's view. If he determined their evil intentions, then why not excuse their sin? Why hold them responsible? So take a note. I try to say this a lot because I think it's important. I'm going to go over some of this here I got written. In Calvinism, God holds man responsible for what God alone controls and decides. Okay? That's Calvinism. There ain't no other way around it. That is their view. But we'll finish the clip.
Knew that God had restrained them from killing him. And yet, in the very same sentence, he says, God intended it for good and to save many alive to this day. He uses the exact same Hebrew term in both places. It can't be avoided. And so in one horrific act, I mean, think of the evil of the brothers in deceiving their father in his grieving and wailing and sending their brother off into slavery. This is horrible stuff.
Horrible stuff that God determined unchangeably to happen. And man had no control over doing things differently. Okay, so I don't think that's helping his case. He acts bothered by the horror of the evil things that these brothers did. But remember, in his view, God is the one choosing for them to do this, and they can do nothing but what God determines for them to be and do. Inconsistent, you see. Shannon Herring says, hearing James White talk seems like a Molinist using this language. Yeah, that's why I think it's inconsistent. Or not even a Molinist, but just a non-Calvinist. But yeah, when he says, like earlier, he said God knows what's in their heart. God restrains their evil. And every time I hear that, I think, that works in non-Calvinism, not Calvinism. Now Walter says, man is already sinning, but passively allows them to act freely within their sin nature. God utilizes their sin for the greater good. Now Walter, even though we could debate the sin nature phrase, of course, but what you just said sounds like my view. See, it sounds like, Walter, to be honest, you should call up here and say, I renounce Calvinism. I'm with you, AK, because that's what I believe. 100%. Man is already sinning, but you see, in Calvinism, you're not going back to the problem. You can't start with man is already sinning because God determined for man to be sinning in the first place. This already sinning that man is doing in Calvinism is what God determined for him to do. Man is doing nothing but what God determined for him to do in Calvinism. That's the problem. But you, Walter, see, I agree with your statement there. You should become a non-Calvinist. And as the truth of it is, Walter, and I know you're a smart guy. I think you should just give it up. I think you're going to be there one day. And I'm saying this in somewhat lightheartedly, but honestly, what you just said sounds like you should be more on my side, to be honest with you. And especially if you're saying that you are like a Molinist. I think you should just say, I forget Calvinism. I should just be a non-Calvinist. Now, once again, you realize I'm being lighthearted with you. But I think what you said is true, but doesn't work in Calvinism. Man, colds. Who needs them? Okay. Now,
that sense, but I mean,
all right. Now, when we come back to this clip, Dr. Craig is going to respond to the Genesis 50, but let's do it ourselves first. Now, I'm going to use online here the Legacy Standard Bible, which I've been telling you guys about. I bought one, and before I ever say, you know what, this is going to be my primary Bible, I'm going to spend time in it, as I already have online. But I got this new translation. It's based upon the NASB, which I was already using, and so far I love it. And as someone who studies the original Greek, I'm here to tell you that so far I like it. But anyway, I say that in case you ask what translation is he using. Okay, now Drew brings up Romans 9. Yes, the big Romans 9. I'm going to have a debate and a discussion on that, so I'm going to try to put off my comments. But I tell you what, I do apologize once again for my code. I know it's not very pleasant to see me blowing my nose. I got some, let's go to not Ephesians, but Genesis 50. All right. Now, I set up the context for the Genesis 50. Oh, and I was going to say, Walter says, but he, God, doesn't determine every sin that man is involved in. Okay. Stay tuned, Walter, because I've got several quotes from Calvinists saying exactly the opposite of that. And if you disagree with them, you shouldn't be a Calvinist. I mean, in all honesty, Walter, so I'm agreeing with you here, but I don't know how you can say you're a Calvinist. You should just stop being a Calvinist and just be what I am, a non-Calvinist, and I think you're already there. You're already there, just a few steps in my direction, and see, I think it'll be good. But, okay, but stay tuned, Walter, because I got some material from Calvinists that I'm going to share. Okay, Jacob is buried. Oh, I skipped ahead here. Okay. Now his brothers are worried about, now that Jacob the father is dead, Joseph might be mad because of what we did in the past. Now here's what he says. Joseph says this, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to do what has happened on the stage, to keep many people alive. All right, Drew, good night. Thanks for being a part. Now, so Walter says, I have a misunderstanding of this area. I'm about to show you quotes from the famous Calvinist. I don't have a misunderstanding. I think you're just not in agreement with popular Calvinism in this respect, Walter. Just stay tuned and you'll see these quotes that I'm going to share. And they're pretty plain, okay? Now, so this is the only statement relevant in this whole discussion, but here's what James is arguing. He's saying, you see, God means this evil that they did as good, but they mean it for evil. And he says, you see, there it is. Well, no, I don't see. I don't see that that's what it is. You see, here's the problem. How does that prove Calvinism? You see, here's what is being assumed. You always have to watch the assumption. You see, what he's assuming to make the argument that this is proving Calvinism is he's got to assume that God also determines their intentions. But Joseph says, you meant. But you notice what the text needs to say to prove Calvinism is that God determined what they meant. But it doesn't say that here. It doesn't support that concept. That has to be presupposed. But if you have to come to the text, I see we got some spam there in the chat. I'm going to get rid of that. see. And just getting rid of some spam. All right. Now, you see, all this says is that they meant something for evil that God meant for good. But it doesn't say that their intentions, as I agree with Walter here, it doesn't say their intentions were determined. So this works for me. You see, this is actually a text that supports my view. You see, I believe that man freely determined their own choices, and God can use their choices. Not as if He's just spontaneously seeing what they're doing in the moment and then doing everything on the spur of the moment. No, God is working all things according to the counsel of His will, including man's free choices. The only thing, I just want to be clear, the only thing the text says is that what they meant for good, for evil, God meant for good. But it doesn't say that they did not have any choice. It does not say that God determined their intentions. You can't get this from the text, so it does not support Calvinism. This is what I believe. You see, God is using evil brothers who are jealous, and He's using their evil to bring about His good. That's not Calvinism. Calvinism is He determines their evil. You see, but it becomes problematic because James White just said He doesn't excuse their evil. Yeah, but in Calvinism, it doesn't make sense for Him to hold them responsible for what He determined. But in my view, He can hold them responsible because they were the ones who intended the evil. It's that simple. Now, I'm going to go to something here, and we'll return to the clips here in just a second. Remember this, because it is very true. Now, when Walter here says not all Calvinists believe alike, well, if you do not have these views that I'm about to show, then I don't think that you can really be a Calvinist. I mean, you call it Calvinist, but it's not Calvinism. It's not what Calvin taught. It's not what the popular Calvinists say. So then why, Walter, are you calling it Calvinism? Why not just call it something else? You know, here's something that happened that I think this is an example of the problem I think they face. Dr. White was asked in a debate he did once, when a child is raped, is God responsible? And did He decree that rape? Now, Dr. White answered, if He didn't, then that rape is an element of meaningless evil that has no purpose. Okay, well, even though I disagree with his answer, but you notice what he's saying. He's saying, if God didn't decree, which is an admission that He did decree the rape. White was pressed further on the question by the moderator and answered again. James White says, I mentioned to him, yes, in other words, yes, God is responsible for the rape. Because if not, then it's meaningless and purposelessness. So he's saying it would be bad if God wasn't responsible for the rape, because then the rape would have no purpose or meaning. Even though that's actually not true. It has an evil purpose and an evil meaning by the rapist. But there's no virtue in, well, as long as it's got a good purpose by God, if He's then decreeing the rape, then that's okay then. No. Now, Walter says, no Calvinist would say that God forces them to do evil if that's what you mean by God determining all evil. Now, let me ask you this, Walter. Now, I'm about to read these men who disagree with you. Can man choose other than, different than what God first chose for him to choose? So let's say Bob has two choices, an evil choice to do evil or to do good. Now, can Bob choose other than what God unchangeably decreed for him to choose already? But let's see what the Calvinists say here. Now, John Calvin said this, by predestination we mean the eternal decree of God by which he determined with himself whatever he wished to happen with regard to every man. All are not created on equal terms, but some are preordained to eternal life, others to eternal damnation. And accordingly, as each has been created for one and other of these ends, we say that he has been predestined to life or to death. John Calvin also said, creatures are so governed. Now you said they're not forced. Well, let's see if that works with what Calvin himself said. Creatures are so governed by the secret counsel of God that nothing happens but what he has knowingly and willingly decreed. The first man fell because the Lord deemed it meet or proper that he should. Okay, John Piper says this. John Piper is a famous Calvinist nowadays. Never is man the ultimate or decisive cause of his preferences and choices. When man's agency and God's agency are compared, both are real, but God's is decisive. Yet, and here's the mystery that causes so many to stumble, God is always decisive in such a way that man's agency is real and his responsibility remains, but he calls it a mystery. David Steele and Curtis Thomas, Calvinists, say this. Every man makes choices throughout life, but inasmuch as Adam's offspring are born with sinful natures, they do not have the ability to choose spiritual good over evil. Consequently, man's will is no longer free, as Adam's will was free before the fall. Instead, man's will, as a result of inherited depravity, is in bondage to his sinful nature. Now, if they do not have the ability to choose spiritual good over evil, doesn't that mean they are being forced by the nature that they were determined to be born with? They're being forced by something. If they do not have the ability to choose good, then they are being forced by something. And whatever that something is, Walter, God is the one that determined it, not man. You say it is his desires. Who determined his desires? You say it's his nature. Who determined his nature? Lorraine Bettner says, in matters pertaining to his salvation, the unregenerate man, the lost non-Christian, is not at liberty. Doesn't that mean he's being forced in some way? If a person had his liberty taken away by being put in prison, isn't that by force? If he doesn't have the liberty, that means he's being restrained. He's being forced. But Lorraine Bettner says, in matters pertaining to his salvation, the unregenerate man is not at liberty to choose between good and evil, but only to choose between greater and lesser evil, which is not properly free will. What it does mean is that since the fall, man rests under the curse of sin, that he is actuated by wrong principles, and that he is wholly unable, he's forced, to not love God or to do anything meriting salvation. Now, I agree with the last statement that man doesn't merit salvation. John Calvin said, God arranges all things by his sovereign counsel in such a way that individuals are born who are doomed from the womb to certain death. So if you're born doomed from the womb, that means you have no choices to do anything other than. You know what that's called? That's called force. If God determines for you to be born doomed from the womb, guess what? That's force. There's nothing more forceful than God, right? God is the biggest force in the universe. So if he's determining for you to be born a sinner and to be lost for eternity, then guess what? That's force. No bigger force in the universe than God himself. Yeah, salvific context. That's what we're talking about. And it's force. When we're talking about being a sinner, because you said earlier, man is not being forced to be a sinner or to do evil. Yeah, so therefore, if he's being So do you admit that in a salvific or a salvation context that he is being forced, which is what we're talking about, is it not? But I got some text that says that this stuff doesn't work with Calvinism, and then when we will return to the videos, this doesn't work. You see, if you take all those quotes, let's just go through these. Deuteronomy 32. Oops. The Bible says, the rock, talking about God, his work is perfect, for all his ways are just. A God of faithfulness and without injustice, righteous and upright is he. But let's take some of those many quotes that we just, or several anyway, of quotes that we just took from famous Calvinists, John Calvin himself, and let's see if it works. Now this says all God's ways are just. But what about all the injustice in the world? Who determined that? God. Well, isn't it his way? If God unchangeably determines everything, wouldn't you say that's his way too? So all the unjust ways of man are themselves a way of God, because he's the one that determined it. It says he is without injustice, but remember that any injustice that exists in the universe was determined, unchangeably so, to happen first and foremost by him. Walter, you can call in all you want, but it's going to be a back and forth discussion. You know what I'm saying? It's just the nature of it. But yeah, go ahead. You can call in. Until then, let me go on to Psalm 25. It says, God is upright, or good and upright is Yahweh. Therefore, he instructs sinners in the way. But if we take a look at or if we include the concepts just taught to us by the quotes from Calvinists, the sinners were sinners in the first place because he determined for them to be. So he's going to instruct them in the way and help them not be what he determined for them to be in the first place. See, no, I think there's a better way to understand that. If they're sinners by their own choices, now see, that works pretty well. You're on live.
Hello, AK.
Hey, Walter, what's on your mind?
Well, I just wanted to try to clarify some things. I think that all of the quotes that you were quoting were basically within a salvific context, and what you quoted before and the illustration that you gave out of Genesis with Joseph and the brothers and the evil that they had done, and that God, they meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That's not really a salvific issue. And so, what a Calvinist would say, and you and I agreed upon what we understood about, Joseph and the brothers, what had happened there, what transpired there. I think that you and I are on the same page. But in regards to, when I'm talking about salvific issues, I'm talking about the initial action that God must do in order to save out of humanity who continually sin all the time, who don't seek after God, who do not know God, that he has to intervene in a positive way to get them to see the kingdom of God and then respond to it. And in that sense, yes, he actively decrees that, right? In other words, there's a positive action there where he has to be involved and intervene in order for them to see, to be given the, faith, to be given that repentance, which would lead to salvation. Now, that's active. But on the passive side, in the course of our normal lives, he allows men to act freely within the confines of their nature, which is to sin. So men sin, and they choose not to sin, they choose to sin, they make decisions every day. But he passively allows them to do that. He doesn't actively force them to sin. And so it's not inconsistent with Calvinistic thought to have this type of understanding.
Yeah,
R.C.
what you're
Sproul-
explaining is a view called compatibilism.
Yeah. So R.C. Sproul also, states the same thing. Some people talk about predestination and how is there double predestination, and some Calvinists would say yes. Well, there's a hard double predestination. In other words, he predestines some to go to hell, but he actively predestines some to go to heaven, and then he actively predestines some to go to hell. Now, R.C. Sproul is not one of those that believes that, and I don't either, because we believe that God actively predestines some to heaven, but he passively, in his one choice of actively determining who will go to heaven, by default, the rest are left for destruction. So, if I choose to fill a cup halfway, I've made two choices. I've also chosen to fill the cup halfway actively, but passively, I've allowed the other half of the cup to be empty. And it is in this type of understanding that I see that Calvinism is not necessarily inconsistent.
Okay, but all right. Excuse me, I gotta blow my nose again.
No problem.
Oh man, not good for a live program, Walter. To be.
I thought I'd get you while you were down.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. So what you have explained is compatibilism, but now, and we've had this discussion before, so I think I know where it goes. But so let me ask you now. What you said was that man is choosing in accordance with his nature. That God allows. These are your words. God allows man to choose to sin, and he's doing what his nature dictates. But you know what I'm going to ask? Who determined man's nature in Calvinism?
Well, I believe that is determined by man's choice initially. Okay?
Can you show me where man ever made a choice that all men would be born with a nature that only allows them to be sinners? Where did they make that choice?
I believe in the garden.
Well, man chose in the garden to eat the forbidden fruit, but they didn't choose the consequences.
So God set up the scenario, the circumstances, as both, James and also William Craig were talking about certain circumstances. The circumstances were set up. The law was established not to partake of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
And that was a law of negation. And they, by taking that fruit, determined in their free will choice, both Adam and Eve, to partake of that. And then from that point forward, that determination was really their choice. And so God laid out, he didn't force them to do that. He set up the circumstances by which they made a free will choice, and therefore sin transferred to all men, as it says in Romans 5, from the first Adam.
Okay, but hold on a second.
You don't.
Can you show me in Genesis where it ever says anything about one of the punishments being that all of Adam's progeny will be born with sin natures that only allow them to be sinners?
I wouldn't say that it necessarily says that in Genesis, but it does. Paul refers to that in Romans 5, where he says that by the first Adam, by one man's transgression, sin passed to all men.
Well, but it doesn't say anything in that text about a sin nature.
Well, the thing is this. It says that sin transferred, and it was a corporate transferring of that sin to all men.
Yeah. Well, no, see, you're not understanding what I'm asking about. I
yeah.
get that man faces consequences for Adam's sin, but the question is, who determined that man would be born with a nature that does not allow him to be anything but a sinner? I mean, who made the choice of what that would be?
It wasn't God's choice necessarily to go ahead and he was not involved in that. What he did was when he made man, and that day it was good. Okay, everything that God created was good. Okay.
Okay, but wait a minute. So are you saying that Adam's choice to eat of the tree was not determined already by God?
Well, I would say that God, in his omniscience, by planting the tree there, okay, knowing that the planting of the tree there and establishing the law of negation upon that tree is what stirred sin within Adam to go ahead and transgress. I mean, without the law, there is no sin. So there had to be an establishment of a negative law.
Okay, but
This is the first negative law that God imposed upon Adam. All the rest are positive laws.
But wait a minute. Let's stay on the pinpoint problem here. Now, do you believe that Adam is a part? Do you believe with this statement by John Calvin, creatures are so governed by the secret counsel of God that nothing happens but what He has knowingly and willingly decreed?
Yes, but I believe in an active decree and a passive decree.
Okay, so did Adam have the freedom to choose not to eat of the tree?
I already said that, yes.
Okay, so then his choice wasn't determined by God.
That's correct. But the conditions.
Well, that's not what Calvinists believe, though, Walter.
But this is the thing. Not all Calvinists believe everything that Calvin said. You know that.
Do you agree with the Westminster and London Baptist Confession of Faith that God has unchangeably decreed all things that come to pass?
I believe that.
Okay, so then you just contradicted what you just said, because if you say that Adam had, hold on a second, if Adam had the choice to not eat of the tree, then it wasn't unchangeable. So did Adam have the freedom to choose other than what God unchangeably decreed that he would do?
Adam always had the choice.
So then it was changeable.
So in other words, God, and this is where we dissect, things a little bit deeper. That there are Calvinists that believe in the active, or the rather than the active passive, right? Decrees of God. So we still feel that if God allows certain things to take place, that's still within His own determination that those things should take place. It's not outside of His decree. A decree can involve passive elements as well as His actively involved, actions to cause the greater good of things to happen. And so this is the reason why I can be a Calvinist in some ways agree with what you're saying on other passages. And you're kind of like stepping back and saying, well, I'm kind of surprised because this is not what Calvinists. Well, no, some hardcore Calvinists, that believe in the active, yeah, of course, they're going to go ahead and disagree with me, and I disagree with them. But yet still, both of us are 5-point Calvinists.
Well, I'm not surprised, because what you are espousing is compatibilism, which I'm familiar with. And I do know, I even have a quote where they talk about the free will that Adam had before the fall. So I know some Calvinists believe this. I believe that's inconsistent because of other arguments they make. But let me stay on this point. So you said God passively allows certain people. Did God choose who is going to be saved and who is going to be lost?
I believe that.
Okay, so all the sinners, do they have any ability in Calvinism, or in your view, do they have any freedom to be saved? Do they have any chance to be saved?
No, I wouldn't call it chance. Do they have any freedom to choose to be saved? If that, just for clarification purposes, because you just said freedom, so you're saying the freedom to choose to be saved, not after the fall. No.
Okay.
Okay,
So every man today that's going to end up in hell does not have the choice to do anything but, okay? So it was God that chose for them to be in this condition. So how can he hold them responsible for what they cannot do otherwise?
I wouldn't word it like that. See, AK, I wouldn't word it like that.
Okay, so let's word it this way instead.
So what God hasn't chosen
Okay.
them to
Well,
go
let's
ahead and be
hold on
that
a
way.
second. Okay, just stop for a moment. Let's reword it then, okay?
Okay,
So does any man today standing on this earth have any control over following God or not?
He has none prior to the regenerative process taking place.
Well, even after that, I mean, everything he does is determined, is it not?
Now he can. Yes, he can pursue God, and he desires
Okay.
to pursue him. He desires
Okay,
to
so
yes,
leaving
after
aside the
regenerative
Christian
state.
then, because,
Yeah.
I would have
But
some things to
men
say about
prior
that.
to regeneration, and this is where I'm talking, that many of the quotes that you've talked about have to do within the context of salvation or the doctrine of salvation. Okay, so I mean I'm hearing you when you're quoting Pink and what is it, Bettner and all those guys. I'm familiar with all of them, and I understand what they're saying, but basically you can't take those quotes and basically apply them to, let's say, for instance, a Genesis 50 passage, or what is it, or the parables of the kingdom type of passages.
Well, but it was James White is the one using the Genesis 50,
Yeah.
but
Well, yeah, because I think that some Calvinists are incorrect in extrapolating too much out of that text to say that it's necessarily a salvation passage. Okay, whereas I don't necessarily believe that. I believe that God did that, judicially hardened Pharaoh's heart for the express I went to another passage altogether. When you were I quoted with you before in text. We talked about how Pharaoh's heart was hardened, but I said that the Pharaoh's heart was hardened in order to maintain the Hebrew people as a special nation, separate from
yeah.
the and to protect against the commingling of the Hebrew people with the Egyptian people in order to preserve the seed line of the
Okay.
Messiah through this special nation.
Well,
So
let me
I
get
think
us
it's
back
for
on the.
greater- I think
Okay,
it's
but
for
hold
the
on.
greater good
I got to get us
that he
back
does
on
that.
track, Walter. So let me ask you
Yeah.
this question. Now, you just said a second ago, in answer to my question, that the unregenerate man, which is the sinner, someone who's not a Christian, has no control over any part of his choices. Now, you did concede that, right? That the sinner has no control over any of the choices that he makes.
Prior to regeneration, yes.
Okay, so then
Fallen
you
man-
would concede with
fallen
the
man-
statement here that God holds him responsible for only the things that God controls and decides, right?
Fallen man has already been judged.
But my question is, so you would agree with the idea that God holds these people responsible for what only he controls?
No, what they have controlled themselves.
You just said
Okay.
that they had no control.
No, what they have, and they have only control of the fact that they sin all the time.
Now,
They don't
you
have
just
any control. They don't have any control of choosing God. There's none who seek for God. There's none who understand. All have turned aside, and together they become useless.
Now,
There's
I
none
asked
who does
you-
good, no, not
I
one.
asked you if they have any control over anything they do, and you said no.
No,
I
they
mean,
do not.
okay,
They
so
do
then,
not salvifically.
yeah, well, I mean, the responsibility, we're talking about salvation ultimately. I mean, all the choices man makes include moral choices. It's only those moral choices that have to do with salvation, because it's the moral choices of evil that make him condemned in the first place. And those are the things that, I mean, God isn't holding anybody responsible for the fact that they chose chocolate ice cream over vanilla. So when we're talking about Him holding them responsible, it's for moral choices that they make, which you just said.
But see, I'm not talking about moral choices here. I'm talking about the choice of choosing God apart from our temporal moral choices that we would necessarily make in our lives. I believe that we have freedom of will to choose. Well, a mother, even though she's an unregenerate heathen, will have love for her child. And, that's undeniable. She can love her child and love her children, and
Okay, wait a second,
die
though.
for her children
Wait.
and still do good.
Okay, when you say that a mother,
God.
if you, hold on a second, when you say that a mother can love her children, that's only if God determines for her to love her children, is it not?
Yeah, but the thing is this, in His determination, if it's passive, He allows them to work within the confines or within the, the confines of what what we're able to do.
Yeah, so what you're saying
free.
is, okay, I got to keep this simple because keep it simple and on point. But let me say this, Walter. So what you're saying is, you're conceding that man has a nature like a mother, and she has with the freedom within that nature to make choices to love her children or not. Isn't that the case?
Of course she does.
Okay, so, but the problem is, and let me just ask you.
That's not a salvific issue, though.
It doesn't matter. The Calvinist theology says that God determines everything. Are you telling me that there are choices, like loving your children or not, that God has not determined for man to make?
That all falls within determination.
My question is this, Walter. Has God not determined some conflicting choices that man will make? For example, to love your children or to not. Are there choices like those, two conflicting choices that He has not determined one way or the other for a person to make?
He doesn't have to determine.
Does He do it or not?
I don't think so.
Okay, so then that's not really consistent with what Calvinists are saying. They say they say that God determines everything. You ask James White, Walter, if God has ultimately determined. Okay, so let me just say it right now. You disagree with John Piper, is it not the case? Because he says man is never the ultimate or decisive cause of his preferences. So if a mother prefers to love her children, it's God, in his estimation, that is the ultimate or decisive cause. So you disagree with John Piper.
What I'm saying is that all of those passages, it's like me going ahead and saying, taking my arbitral test. Okay, I'm going to go off course here, just a little bit, just a short illustration. I went ahead and took studying for my arborist test, okay? And then I read down a paragraph, and it says, all trees take in oxygen. Well, I went to high school and college, and it says, I was always taught that, no, trees don't take in oxygen, they take in carbon dioxide, and then give off oxygen. That's what we breathe, right? And so I put a big X in the book. I said, this is just absolutely ridiculous. And then I went back to go through it again. And then I realized, well, just a moment, this was subterranean. I think that this is what you're doing. Okay, you're taking certain passages or quotes from Calvinists who clearly are sharing these things within the context of in the initial choice that we have to make for God or His choice of us, and you're taking that and putting it into a realm or the spectrum of our temporal everyday life and making it a moral issue and moral choices. And then you're imposing that same type of God actively changing our hearts, okay, salvifically, and taking that same type of action and then imposing it in a negative way with sin. And no, you can't do that.
You just don't understand what the Calvinists are saying, Walter. They say that God determines every choice that a man makes. That there isn't anything. As a matter of fact, Walter, that's why they argue that to believe that man can make a libertarian, what you're talking about, and what I believe is called a libertarian free will, that a mother can freely choose to love her children or not, and that God hasn't determined one way or the other, that's called a libertarian free will. Most of us just call it free will. The Calvinists will say it's a libertarian free will. They deny libertarian free will.
Not all
Compatibilism
Calvinists do that.
denies libertarian free will. You said it earlier. We can only do what our nature says.
Initially, okay? But the thing is this, on a temporal level, okay, I would say that an unregenerate, like I shared with you before, an unregenerate mother can love her child and do those things. Those things, God doesn't necessarily actively have to be involved in. He's not forcing them to do evil or forcing the mother to do good or whatever. I mean, he's just allowing them to do that. And it's not
It's not the view of typical
with
Calvinism, though.
thought. No, it's not inconsistent with Calvinistic thought because there's many Calvinists that believe like I do.
But that's what none of these guys are saying. That what you're talking about is libertarian free will, and it's not. Now listen. As far as what you said about the grandmother with the freedom to choose to love her children or not, and that God hasn't determined it, I agree with you. I'm not saying you're wrong. But it's not what Calvinism says. You have a partial aspect of Calvinism, but let's get off of these things and go to the most important things, the things that affect our eternity, Walter. So when it comes to our moral choices for which we end up in heaven or hell for, do you agree that man has no control over his moral choices? I'm talking about man the way he's born. I'm not talking about the Christian. Let's say every man who ends up in hell, how much control did he have over his moral choices that got him there?
None.
Okay, so God is holding him responsible and sending him to hell for what God alone controls and decides. Now, will you agree with that?
That was the nature that man assumed.
Yes or no? Do you agree that God holds man responsible for what God alone controls and decides?
After he had partook of the
So then,
fruit
yeah.
of
So
knowledge
the
of
answer
good and
is
evil.
yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, he does, but...
Thank you, Walter. I appreciate that.
No, but that's not... I mean, you're not winning the argument by going ahead and making such a statement.
What I'm showing is that...
you understand... It's just that you don't understand that there's a passive decree and an active decree. I mean, you have a child, don't you?
No, it doesn't matter. You just said, all that I'm trying to establish in this is the fact of what I continually state, is that you as a Calvinist believe that man goes to hell for something he absolutely has no control over. You cannot rationalize that.
Man cannot choose God prior to God's involvement. We only love him because he first loved us.
Yeah, you just said that. I get it. I mean, I agree. You just said, we get that. That's your position. What I'm saying is...
I mean, that's the whole thing.
It is irrational, and the Bible doesn't... the Bible doesn't teach, first of all, what you say, but even if it did, it's a hard time rationalizing that man is held responsible for something he has absolutely no control over.
No, because man will always choose sin. That's all we did prior to our regeneration.
Because God determined, he had no control. That's all he could do, Walter, right? Isn't that the case?
Of course. But
well, so then, I mean...
That's how our nature was. So God had to intervene out of a fallen race of humanity that didn't await judgment, but awaited their execution.
For something they had no control over, Walter.
Out of that executed race of humanity, has chosen some to be his own.
Yeah, so he's chosen to punish for eternity certain individuals for things they had absolutely no control over. You see, that's the problem with Calvinism. That's when it comes to the problem of evil. Now, it's a different discussion. Me and you can go to the Bible and start... Hold on a second. Wait. Okay. You and I could go to the Bible and start going, does this teach what you're saying or what I'm saying? But assuming what you're saying is true, it's just a problem when it comes to evil, because you can't rationalize something being held responsible and punished and sent to hell for eternity for something they have absolutely no control over.
Listen, this is the issue. The issue is this, is that all men sinned against God. You know, the question that we should be
He determined for them to do it.
Just a moment. The question that we should be asking ourselves is, why would God save any of us? I mean, he didn't have to. We've sinned, and the penalty for sin is death. and damnation. The real question is, why would God even save any of us? I mean, it's not like God is wrong for going ahead and choosing some to be his own,
Wait a
out of
second.
the fallen race of humanity.
I want
It's
to
none
answer
of
your
it,
question.
I mean, God doesn't work according to the Constitution of the United States that he has to be fair to everybody.
But wait a minute.
No.
When you ask, why would God save anybody? You mean, why would God save any of the people that he determined to be sinners in the first place?
That's the whole thing.
Well, so I don't have any sympathy. Why would God save the people that are lost because of what his choosing in the first place? Now, it's one thing in my view when they are sinners and they are wicked by their own choices. Why would God save them? I get it. But why would he save them? Well, I think he probably should save them since he's the one that made them lost in the first place. If we're just talking about the rationality of what you're talking about.
No, but God utilized evil, and evil was around prior to the fall of man.
Okay, let me ask you this, and this will be the last, and then I'm going to continue on.
Yeah.
The very first evil thought that ever existed in the universe, we assume it's Satan, right?
Yeah.
Was that determined by God unchangeably?
I don't know if that was determined by God, but I believe that God knew it.
Okay, but you agreed with the Westminster Confession of Faith earlier, which says that he decreed all
but
things.
The thing is this, being that God is omniscient and he knows all things, then when he created Satan, or, Lucifer, he knew what he was going to do, but he created him in lieu of the fact that he knew what he was going to do.
But you agreed with the Westminster Confession of Faith, though, which says that he didn't know, but it says that he unchangeably decreed, or one says decreed, one says ordained. But so you already, now you're saying, well, I don't know that he did that, but you agreed with the confessions that said that he did in fact do that. So
Yes,
is that not a part of, is the
know.
first evil thought that ever entered Satan's heart not a part of whatsoever comes to pass?
No, it was decreed.
Okay, so then, yes, you believe he did determine that.
I believe that it was decreed that also in God's omniscience, that God knew he wasn't fooled, that he knew that planting the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in that garden, would be the very thing that would cause man to fall.
Okay, well,
And
what
so,
you're...
I do believe that. I believe that it was for another purpose, though, in order to take man to a higher level of understanding good and evil, and then ultimately making us sons of God. And so, he utilizes that. Now we understand what good and evil is. Before,
Well, see, I agree with all
back
that,
when
Walter.
we think that he knew what good and evil.
I agree with you there, but see, that's my view. Because I'm the one who,
no,
I can
that's
say, hold on a second, I can say that God knows what people are going to do. I can say God knows what people are going to do, but in Calvinism, he doesn't just know something, he actually decrees. See, this is a low form of Calvinism. These Calvinists that are known, these Calvinists that John Calvin himself would utterly disagree with you. God doesn't just know something.
Yeah, of course they would disagree with me, but there's Calvinists on another side that don't hold to this also. And
So stop calling yourself a Calvinist. You're not a Calvinist.
Not all Trinitarians or not all Arminians agree with each other, okay? So, there's, you're taking, fine points, and maybe we're going to go ahead and disagree on this and that, but you can't go ahead and take a broad brush and say, okay, let's take all Calvinism and just sweep them under the rug and put me under the rug with those guys because I'm coming onto the show to share with you. No, on the contrary, there's Calvinists like me that would agree with you on many of the points that you're bringing up.
Well,
and it doesn't have to contradict Calvinism. You're trying
Walter,
to make
you're
it
the one
no.
calls yourself a Calvinist, and so if you disagree with Calvin and the majority of mainstream Calvinism, then you should probably call yourself something different. But
Listen,
I'm just
no
going to tell you
Calvinist-
something.
but
Hold
no
on, Walter.
Calvinist
I'm going to tell you
believes
something very
everything
important,
that
okay? I'm going to tell you something very important.
Yeah.
The things you have said here are very inconsistent. You have contradicted yourself, and I'm not trying to win an argument. I'm just trying to show you that your positions I agree with you, but when I agree with you, it's because you have been inconsistent. You earlier agreed with the confessions that say he unchangeably decreed whatsoever comes to pass, but yet when I asked you if he unchangeably determined Satan's first evil thought, you said you don't know. That's inconsistent, my friend. Do you see how that's an inconsistency?
But I told you that he decreed them. He decreed that.
Yeah, and
Later,
I told you it was
right?
inconsistent to say you don't know that he unchangeably determined it.
And I think that you're missing my point, because when you say things and you ask me questions, there's two sides of an answer to this thing. It's not just like Judge Judy when she asks the question to the people down there, just answer the question. That's it. It's a black and white. That's it. The answers are not like that.
No, it is like that, Walter. When you said that you agree with the confessions that say God unchangeably determines everything that happens, and then I asked you, so did he unchangeably determine Satan's original evil thought? And you said, I don't know. That's inconsistent. There's no way around that.
And then I go ahead and I tell you, there's an active determination and there's a passive determination with many Calvinists. Okay?
Well, but then you can't say, I don't know, and either one of those answers is inconsistent.
The thing is this. Listen, you have a child. Sometimes you'll grab that child actively. But also in your determination, you can also allow the child to do freely what he wants to do. And it all falls within the context of determination. And then if he starts running out towards that street, you're going to run out there and you're going to actively be involved in that. And then later on, you can passively allow him to work within the confines of what he naturally would do.
Except,
this is not a
that doesn't work.
It's not an issue. You're saying either
you're being
or
inconsistent,
with me, and
Walter.
I'm telling you, there's two sides of this determination issue. There's a positive Calvinist, and there's a positive passive Calvinist. And I'm a positive Calvinist, and more of a compatibilist or whatever,
You're just inconsistent, because if you're being passive, it means you did not determine the things that happen. But if you admit that if you could agree with the confessions that say God unchangeably determined all things, then everything that happens passively is the things that he determined in the first place. He's only allowing the things that he determined.
And that's the reason why we would never say as a Calvinist that he causes people to do evil. Okay? He forces them to do evil.
Well, you can't say that, because John Piper's a Calvinist, and he said that man is not the ultimate cause.
I don't care about John Piper. Come on.
He's a famous Calvinist. See, I'm just telling you, you are not being consistent with the majority of Calvinism. So here's my thing. If you disagree with me lumping you in, well, guess what? I'm not lumping you in. You called to defend yourself as a Calvinist, but if you disagree with with Calvinism in general, then that doesn't include you.
In the sense that I don't necessarily hold to a hardcore Calvinist that, believes that God is actively forcing people to do evil. That's the reason why it came on. And you can't lump me in there.
You lumped yourself, because you said, I didn't say, by the way, this is Walter. I said, you're a Calvinist, but when you say, I don't agree with that, well, then guess what? You're not a part of the lump.
Well, I'm not a part of the hardcore lump, but there's a group of Calvinists that's not like that. And I'm trying to share that.
They're not. Okay, I'm going to have to get on with my videos, because I know that's what...
No problem. It was good talking with you, though.
All right, thanks for calling in.
Okay, take care, buddy. Bye-bye.
All right, everybody, I'm going to move on to the videos and just cut that, because I know people come here for what I tell people we're going to do, so let's just... Now, I appreciate the phone calls, but eventually I got to get back to it. All right, so let's look at this.
Let's take that example from Scripture, Joseph and his brothers. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. I mean, is that a kind of a good example of Calvinism, or could it just as equally be applied to
it's a great example of Molinism. I love the Joseph story because it so perfectly illustrates human freedom within the providence of God. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good and has brought it to pass. God didn't move the brothers to hate Joseph, to kill him, to throw him into a pit, to lie to their father. That would make God the author of evil. But God knew that if they were in this situation, they would behave in these evil ways, but that ultimately this would redound to the salvation of Israel and its rescue from famine and all the rest. So this is a story that wonderfully illustrates, I think, how Molinism resolves the antinomy of human freedom and evil and God's sovereign providence.
And is in that respect, I agree. I mean, the text just says that they intended it for evil. And everything Walter just said on the phone agrees with that. Now, I think it's inconsistent with other things he says, but it's just not. Now, that's what Walter was talking about on the phone, and the things that Walter agreed to is not what James White will say. So it's just not the same kind of Calvinism that we're dealing with. But, so, I agree, and we're going to move on from this.
And the fact that this wasn't introduced into theology until Molina, I think, is a function of the fact that although people were groping for this view prior to Molina, you can show historically people foreshadowing this. It took a theological giant of the stature of someone like Molina to draft and defend this theory. It is brilliant.
So, I'm not a Molinist, not all that amazed by Molina, yeah, but we're going to keep going.
And so it wasn't an attempt to undermine the Reformation. What it was an attempt to do was to reconcile divine sovereignty and human freedom. Molina was under the conviction that Calvin and Luther had annihilated human freedom, and he wanted to show that you can affirm full divine sovereignty, but without turning human beings into automata and making God the author of evil.
Now that statement that you can affirm divine sovereignty, in other words, we could agree that God is sovereign, but we could agree that He's sovereign and say that He didn't determine for men to do evil. So, but yet, James White makes the argument quite often, and a lot of Calvinists do, that if man has libertarian free will, or what most of us just call free will, then God isn't sovereign. Which I know it seems that Walter would not agree with that, but that's a common argument from Calvinists. That if man has free will, then God's not sovereign. But evidently, Walter disagrees with that. Well, so do I. The word sovereignty just means to have all authority. Sovereignty means the right to rule in authority. The question is, does He choose to rule over creatures that He has given free will, or has He chosen to rule over creatures that choose as He determines for them to choose? It's not a question of sovereignty. Absolutely. We all agree that God is sovereign. It's a question of what does He do in His sovereignty that we have to decide what does the Bible teach. And I think as Walter was agreeing to some respect with me, contrary to primary taught Calvinism, yeah, he does allow in his sovereignty man to make free choices. But the most important ones, as Walter said, moral choices, those are the ones that matter the most. The most important choices, God has not given us the freedom. That's unfortunate, because those are the ones that we are held responsible for.
And if we can come back later, I want to give James a chance here, but I'd like to come back and offer an argument based on the Bible for the truth of the doctrine of middle knowledge.
I would love to hear that. Yeah, I think that's a very important thing to do, and I'm sure James would respond. But there you go. I mean, as far as Bill's concerned, it fits Molinism better than Calvinism, the Joseph story, James. What do you say to that?
Well, if you're actually going to take something from the Jesuits...
Let me say this. I don't need to say that it fits Molinism. I just say that it doesn't teach Calvinism. As Walter agrees. The text does not say anything unique to Calvinism. The text does not say God determined their evil motives. And by the way, see, that's inconsistent because Walter says the moral choices man has no control over. So, I'm sorry, Walter, but that is absolutely inconsistent. because these are moral choices that we're talking about, that the brothers made. And so James is making the argument that this is Calvinism. You said, no, you and I agree with Genesis 50. That's inconsistent, because these are moral choices which you said, and it is on record, that man has no control over. So then you actually don't agree with me when it comes to Genesis 50.
And the Jesuits, by the way, were charged with undoing the Reformation. That's why Molina did what Molina was doing, but to rescue the sacramental system of Rome. But if you're going to take something that was developed 1,500 years later, read it back into something that was about 1,400 years before Christ, so almost 3,000 years later, as if that's what was trying to be communicated by Joseph, that Joseph had this idea.
No, I'm not.
This happened a lot in this debate. Now, if you watch this debate, what you saw was James White constantly assuming that Calvinism is taught in the Bible, but Molinism, this other theology, well, no, that's not, and it's read into the text. That's called begging the question. Begging the question is when a person makes an argument and assumes the very thing that they're trying to prove. See, he's just assuming when he says, well, what Dr. Craig is doing is he's taking this Molinism idea and he's reading it back in time. And Joseph, when he said that in Genesis 50, he's saying he didn't try to communicate Molinism as if he was trying to communicate Calvinism. No, Calvinism is another theory that absolutely is inconsistent. And where someone like Walter will disagree with mainline Calvinism, Walter's a little bit more consistent with, I believe, the text and with text and logic, the Bible text. But when Calvinists make these arguments that Walter disagrees with, I think that Calvinists are just being consistent with their own theology.
Good. He understood, Joseph understood why, if that's true, if this is a picture of Molinism, why did God have to restrain the brothers from killing Joseph? Didn't he know that that's what they would want to do? He literally violated their creaturely freedom by restraining them from killing Joseph. Remember, the older brother had to be brought in to do that.
But wait a minute. He's violating their creaturely free will and restraining their evil. But remember, Calvinists, not Walter, but James and other typical Calvinists say that God determined everything. And so, he is only restraining the very thing that he himself determined. You see, remember, this is another inconsistent. Now, sorry, Walter, you called, and so I hate to just keep talking about you, but you kind of, you got into it, and I appreciate the fact that you did. I'm not trying to talk about you. You called in, we have a discussion, but it can't be the whole show, just you and I talking. But let me say this. I'll just say it like this, okay? How about this? It is inconsistent for anybody to say that he passively determines the very things that man cannot control. That's inconsistent. Boy, this thing's beating me up. For someone to say that moral choices the sinner has no control over, and then to say that that's part of a passive decree, that's inconsistent. And I don't think that James White would say that. So, if these moral choices man has no control over, as both of these men would concede, then what in the world is he restraining? Because if they had done more evil, guess what? It is admitted by Calvinists that they did not have control over the further evil that they were going to do. Okay, so let that sink in, okay, because this is the inconsistency. To say that he is restraining evil means that whatever the greater evil that they would have done which is also conceded that they have no control over, then who did? Then what is he restraining? Who controls the thing that he restrains? God. See, this doesn't work.
And so how does anything where God hardens hearts so that nations are destroyed, hardens Pharaoh's heart, he restrains evil with Abimelech, he restrains evil with Joseph's brother.
Restrains the evil, but any evil that they would have been committing, they had no control over. So he's restraining the things he controls.
This seems to be God acting against autonomous actions of men. If middle knowledge gave him the basis for just putting him in the proper situations, why would he ever have to then, as Justin put it earlier, if it's a hand...
Middle knowledge is the idea of knowing what man would do. Jill Tillman, I'm assuming that's how you pronounce it. By the way, I can't remember if I said it already, but thanks for being a part of the program. But Jill says, the thing is the character of God. God is a just and loving God. Yeah, I believe it comes down to God's character. I was reading text earlier, and I think I got away from them. Walter called in, and that's fine. I'm just saying, but I didn't get through all the ones I were going to say. It was really about the character of God. At one point in this debate, Dr. Craig said, if it is evil to cause somebody to do evil, then that makes God evil. Under Calvinism, that's right. And that's why we're focusing on this, because that is the problem of evil, where it's an issue of what is it about the character of God.
Off thing, how come there's so much hands getting involved here?
Well, I certainly wouldn't mean to deny God's miraculous intervention in the series of secondary causes. But in the case, for example, was it Reuben who said, let's not kill Joseph, let's throw him in the pit? What we can say is that God knew that this brother would do that and that the others would freely listen to him, rather than say that God is determining them to act in this way. And I'm not suggesting that the biblical author had Molinism in mind. Of course not. What I'm saying is that this is a theory to reconcile sovereignty and human freedom that is consistent with the Bible. It affirms the facts of sovereignty and freedom without bruising or annihilating one set of the data.
But I mean, let's take the...
I'd like a comment here. Now, Walter, he's talking to Jack, but he says, when you fill a glass halfway with milk, and you determine that, did you also passively determine that the other half of the glass to be empty? Two results, results out of one act of choice. But when you have choices being made by creatures, you don't just have emptiness, okay? If you have people making choices, it is not a passive choice when they are making choices that they have no control over. God determines the nature. The moment God determines what nature they are born with is. And by the way, you said basically that Adam chose... No, Adam didn't make any choice like that. Adam chose to sin, and he chooses to face the punishment. And God didn't say that that was the punishment, by the way. I mean, you're reading all that into the text. But it was God that chose that they were going to be born sinners. And so if he's choosing for them to be born sinners, then the fact that they are making these choices is not passive. But anyway. Oops.
So, Bill...
for time's sake, let's skip ahead.
But I mean, let's take the...
So, Bill, when I
and for
when
my
I go to
sake, because
Ephesians
I'm...
1, and I talk about the eudokia of his thelematos, the kind intention, that which is pleasing to him of his will, and that is made to be the very source of everything God has done in predestination, election, It's the counsel of his thelematos, his boule of his thelematos in verses 10, 11, that determines everything that takes place. He's worked all things after the counsel of his will.
Yes.
How is that? That is central to what the Calvinist is saying in regards to God.
What is the assumption? Because he says, it's Calvinism, that in Ephesians 1, it says, God works all things after the counsel of his will. His thelematos, that's the will in Greek, or desire. Okay, we all agree with that. The question is not, does God work all things after the counsel of his will? All my Calvinist friends, you need to hear that we all agree with that. But you make the assumption that it is according to the counsel of his will to determine man's choices. Well, that doesn't say it in the text. That's your presuppositions. Yeah. Shannon says, passing over, this is what Walter has been talking about, is withholding grace. Whew, it's rough here. Now, for those of you who don't know what that means, some Calvinists, as Walter, would say, no, God is not choosing some people for hell. He's just choosing some people for heaven. And he's just not saving the other people. And since God is choosing who goes to heaven, who's going to become a Christian, and only who he chooses can become Christian, which means everybody that God does not choose to save has no control over being saved or lost, as Walter admitted. But some Calvinists, as Walter would say, you see, he's passing over them. Well, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus chose, or rather taught, that it is not good, it is not loving to pass over your enemies or to pass them by. It's the same idea. God is choosing which sick people to save and heal, and he's passing by the others. But Jesus taught that, and he said that you should be loving as your heavenly Father is loving. In other words, the reason we are not to pass by our enemies is because God doesn't. Oops. Now, see now.
So, Bill, when I go to Ephesians 1, to what the Calvinist is saying in regards to God, how God is working, and it is coming forth from the text, do you see a difference between that approach and what you just did with Genesis 50, where you go, yes, this theory comes along 3,000 years later, but we can consistently apply it to what was written all that way back then?
It's the assumption that you have something that you're putting in the text and assuming that Calvinism is in the text. No, they're both got theories. Calvinism, Molinism, they're both theological structures that is trying to fit the scriptural teaching within them. But he just argues as if it's just Molinism that is being constructed out here and brought to the Bible. No, it's Calvinism too. Calvinism isn't taught in the Bible. Even if you want to say, and Calvinists will say, that the concepts of Calvinism are taught, but it's not as if that you can't just assume that, is my point. That has to be proven. Now, I like something here. Elohim Saves says, why share the gospel and why did Jesus go to the cross if God picks and chooses one sinner over another? Yeah, you see, in Calvinism, God comes in and saves the people that he determined to be lost in the first place. That is like the analogy that I use, and it's not original, but it's like a fire company, a fire department setting a building on fire so that they could come and put it out. So, no, that doesn't sound really all that reasonable. And I'll say this. In Calvinism, well, let me say it the other way around. I believe biblically the teaching is that God sacrificed himself for his creation. In Calvinism, God sacrifices His creation for Himself. He sacrifices certain people, gives them no control over being lost, and then gives them up so that He can bring glory to Himself. You see the alternative. But the Bible teaches that God sacrifices Himself by dying on the cross in His Son for His creation. Calvinism, He sacrifices His creation for Himself.
And come up with an interpretation of that. Do you see a difference between having our theology derived from
the text
and having something that determines what our theology can be that comes from outside?
Assuming that Calvinism is in the text, but that's the very thing that has to be proven. They're both. Let me tell you something. Joseph wasn't thinking of Calvinism. Paul in Ephesians 1 wasn't thinking of Calvinism. If it is, that has to be proven. You can't just assume it. So White just keeps saying, do you see the difference from getting your theology from the text, assuming that he does? But William Lane Craig is at least being honest and saying, well, it isn't. And when William Lane Craig admits that his theory of Molinism, well, it isn't his, but you know what I mean, isn't taught in the Bible, he means it isn't explicitly laid out like a Bible passage on Molinism. You know what? James White says the same thing about the Trinity. He knows that the Trinity isn't as a theological label, like the Trinity isn't explicitly laid out in Scripture. There isn't a passage where God says, let me lay out to you the Trinity and explain to you how God is one and three. The Bible doesn't do that. No, we take a variety of things the Bible says and we try to conceptualize it together, and when we do that and find a consistent harmony between all the data, one God, three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit, they're all deity. We harmonize all that, and it can be harmonized, and then we say, this is the Trinity. Yeah, that's what Dr. Craig is attempting to do, whether he's right or wrong, but it isn't any different than when James White goes to the text and brings systematic theology, Reformed theology. It's the same thing.
The text.
Well, I don't think that your theology or the Calvinist theology is derived directly from the text in that way. It seems to me that we're both trying to enunciate theological models that will make sense of the data of Scripture. But the Scripture nowhere teaches unilateral divine determinism.
Unilateral divine determinism, he means Calvinism. And see, he called them out. I'm going to have to bring this to the end. I mean, I'm sure you guys don't want to just see me blowing my nose constantly. So I'm going to probably bring it to a close rather quickly here. But he just called them out. He said, well, the Scriptures don't teach it any more than it teaches his view, which is Molinism. And what he means is you don't find a passage that just lays it out. Here's how God does such and such. And it doesn't do that with Calvinism either. And when you analyze the Scriptures, I'm commenting more on the video, and then sometimes we're commenting on the biblical nature of whether Calvinism is true. You know my view. In the end, I say Calvinism doesn't work. Jack says unilateral divine determinism is consistent Calvinism. I agree.
Every human act, especially evil acts, James. I mean, the Bible says God is not evil and cannot be tempted with evil. And yet on this view, it is God who moves the will of the creature to do sinful acts, and then he punishes them for it.
Okay, so
which was conceded by our friend Walter, that man has no control over his moral choices, but that God holds him responsible. See, that doesn't work biblically, because, first of all, the Bible says that God doesn't cause men to do evil. Evil does not come from Him. The lust of the world, the pride of life does not come from Him. He doesn't tempt man with evil, so on and so forth. But besides that, it is not rational. Now, you could say that the Bible teaches it all day long, and you at least need to concede, but I don't know how to rationalize the fact that God holds men responsible for what man cannot control. Well, if you want to say the Bible teaches that, okay, at least be willing to admit you don't know how to rationalize that concept. What is not a true representation of you? You conceded, if you're talking to me anyway, you conceded, I mean, I could play the video back, that man does not have any control over his moral choices. Well, if man doesn't have control, then it's force, Walter. I mean, it's just as simple as that. I mean, you may not like the word force, because Walter says God doesn't force them to do evil. Yeah, if He chose for them to be born with a sinful nature that only allows them to do evil, yeah, that's called force. I mean, if you look up the definition of force, you're going to see that that's consistent. Okay, if they have no control over their moral choices, then it's being forced upon them. Yes, it is force. I mean, I don't care what you say, Walter, that's force. If they have no control, it's called force. Okay? If I take my son's hand and I start hitting somebody else with it, he's got no control. I mean, he's not stronger than me. Okay, that's force. And it's the same thing if we're talking about our moral choices. If there's something outside of man controlling his choices, which you admit that there is, then it's force. You say it's the force of his nature. Who chose his nature? God did. There's no way around it. It's not passive. God chose the nature, and man is not making the choices. It's just not working for you. Yeah. See, Elohim saves. Irresistible grace. Now that's a Calvinistic term, and that's your theology. Irresistible means it cannot be resisted. That's force. I know you're objecting to these things, but it isn't working. Everybody can see through it. It is force. What's wrong with force, by the way? Well, you don't have to care what I say. I mean, it speaks for itself. If man doesn't control his moral choices, it's force. You shouldn't object to force. I concede that God does things by force. You know, God is going to force a resurrection. What if somebody doesn't want to be resurrected when they die? What if they just want to stay dead? Doesn't matter. You know, God does force some things. I've got no problem saying God forces things. So what's wrong with it? If God, you said you concede that God does not choose. And by the way, let's just use the Christians for example. You said that God chooses who will be saved. You agree with that. That's Calvinism. So do they have a choice? Does a sinner who God has unconditionally chosen before the foundation of the world to become a Christian, does he have a choice? It's called irresistible grace for a reason, Walter. It's a positive good force in regards to irresistible grace. So now you just contradicted yourself. You said it wasn't force, but now it's force. It's force when you like it, but it's not force when you don't. Inconsistent.
So I mean, if it's evil to cause someone to do evil, it makes God Himself evil.
Okay, so when the Bible in Isaiah chapter 10 says that God brings the Assyrians to punish...
By the way, Walter, you said you didn't use my child illustration. I didn't say that you did. I showed you what it means to be force. If a person is not controlling the things that they are doing, if they don't control their bodily movements, then they're being forced by whatever does. And it would be the physical illustration transfers to the moral issues that we're talking about. Okay.
And then turns around and punishes the Assyrians for the haughty attitude of their heart. How is that not more clear than what you just said? You just said that you can derive something from the text, and you derived your desire to say that Calvinism is causing God to be the author of evil and so on and so forth, and we know he won't do that. You can derive something from the text in that way.
Well,
how come when I go to Ephesians 1 and it specifically says it is the desire of his will, that which pleases him, that is doing all things?
Yeah, except a Calvinist, such as yourself, James White, assumes that it's a part of his will to determine your will, which the text doesn't say.
You say, well, no, you just have an outside system.
We agree on that, James, that God issues his decree for his good pleasure, and I would say this factors into it human freedom and how human beings would choose, and it is...
Well, Jill, I appreciate you being a part of the discussion.
God's pleasure not to determine creatures to do evil.
Exactly. See, that's what we're saying. It's not complicated. God does all things just as Ephesians 1:11 says, according to the counsel of his own will. Works all things according to his own good pleasure, which includes the free choices of man. Now, that text doesn't say it, but it doesn't say Calvinist view either. That's the point. You can't go to Ephesians 1:11 and assume it is God's will to determine everybody else's will. You can't assume that.
Them to sin. And it's so ironic because you keep appealing to these scriptural examples that I think support my view. How can God punish the Assyrians for something that he causes them to do?
Assyria, Isaiah chapter 10. We're going to end at 9:30. This is another passage. And Bill here is hitting the nail on the head. Another passage that Calvinists go to a lot, especially James White. So, let's go there. And see the very point that that Bill Craig is making. James White goes to this text and argues as if it teaches Calvinism. But notice that James says he holds the Assyrians accountable for the evil of their own hearts. Yeah, but that's my view and makes sense in my view. The problem is it doesn't make sense in Calvinism's view. Okay, if you don't know Isaiah chapter 10, we're just going to end on this note, okay? Well, you need a context here in Isaiah. So, Israel was a sinful nation in rebellion and would not repent for the most part. So God is promising and prophesying through Isaiah to bring Assyria, the Assyrian Empire, against them and conquer them because of their sin. He's using a pagan, evil nation to punish his own people. But then, after making that very clear, God says he's going to punish Assyria. And so James White and other Calvinists cite this as you see, there's Calvinism. He's using them for his own purposes, and then he's punishing them for doing the very thing he wanted them to do. Yeah, but that's not unique to Calvinism. Calvinism's problem is he's punishing them for the evil that he intended, or for the evil that he determined and for which they had no control over. You see, the text does not say anywhere that God determined the arrogance that Assyria had. And that's what the text says he's punishing them for. Notice. All of this right here is about the arrogance of Assyria. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger. and the staff in whose hand is my indignation. I send it against a godless nation. He's sending it against Israel. And command it against the people of my fury, to capture spoil and to seize plunder. And then verse 7, but it does not intend to act in this way. Notice what he says down here. I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria. This makes sense from a non-Calvinist view. You see, God can punish them for the arrogance of the heart because He did not cause their arrogance. What the text says is that God is using them to punish His people, but it doesn't say He determined their arrogance. God is using an evil empire that wants to destroy, as all empires do, other nations, that wants to conquer other nations. He's using them, giving them the power to do what they want to do, which is conquer Israel. And the reason He's allowing them to do it and giving them the power to do it is because He's wanting to punish Israel. But the text does not say He determined their evil intentions. So it makes sense, therefore, for Him to punish them for their arrogance, because they think that they did it because of their own greatness. That's not Calvinism. In Calvinism, not only does He determine that they will destroy Israel, but He determined their arrogance. And then He's going to punish them for their arrogant heart. The text doesn't say He determined their arrogance. It doesn't say He determined for them to be evil. He's using a nation. And that's all it says. Doesn't work for Calvinism. Read through the text. You'll never see that it says He determined that they would be arrogant. God is sovereign, and He can use an evil nation, an arrogant nation, to do what it wants to do, but for His purposes, and then punish them for their evil. Not Calvinism. Everybody, it's time to bring it to a close. We've reached 9:30. Been a long discussion. I appreciate all the chat as always. And Walter, you know I appreciate you even though I disagree with you. And I appreciate the fact that you put yourself online, you call in and willing to be talked about. When you know, everybody knows that when they enter the discussion that happens. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you guys putting up with my code and my stuffiness going on here. But we must bring it to a close. Remember the debate between me and Tyler Villa? I'm just going to say that again. I guess I can go and bring it up again. Standing for Truth YouTube channel. It's about Romans 9, January 28th. And I've got two others I'll be telling you about.
That sense, but
and remember, if you're new to the program, we're live every Thursday, 7 p.m. Central Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard. You could always be a part of the discussion. Jack, Shannon, everybody, Walter, Leslie Lewis, you know I always appreciate you. Good night and God bless.
Hosanna, Hosanna, forever we'll worship the King. Hosanna, Hosanna, forever we'll worship the King. Oh, measureless might, incomparable love.